Hi folks, Mike Howie here. Before we get into this week's episodes, I want to let you know they're both about domestic violence in pets. We talk about some upsetting information in order to shed light on the real-life experiences of far too many people. This episode may be difficult to listen to, and if it is, please don't push yourself. If you're looking for resources regarding domestic violence, you can visit endingviolencecanada.org or ncadv.org. If you are in immediate need of help, please call 911 or your local emergency services. More links are available in the show notes. This is Defender Radio. I'm Michael Howie, and this is Defender Radio, the podcast for wildlife advocates and animal lovers, brought to you by the Fur Bearers. Don't worry if you've already heard this. There's 2 episodes this week, and both have the same first 30 seconds or so. I struggled with how to write the introduction to these 2 episodes. Domestic violence and the connection to pets is a subject I've long wanted to discuss, and now that I've completed 2 interviews, I'm not sure how to go about talking about it. The unsettling truth is that there is a link between domestic violence and pets. That too often, people have not left dangerous situations due to fear for their beloved pets, or because there aren't options for them to leave with their pets. I spoke with the Urban Resource Institute in New York and Parachutes for Pets in Calgary. The former is a larger organization that offers an array of services, including victim services, legal services, safety planning, shelter space, and homes for families and individuals and more. The latter is a grassroots group creating much-needed community supports for pet families, including specific supports in relation to poverty, social upheaval, and domestic violence. The original plan was to have 1 large episode. But each of these conversations deserve their own space, and that's why you have 2 episodes in your feed this week, 813 Part 1 and Part 2. Urban Resource Institute, America's largest domestic violence residential service provider, and the National Domestic Violence Hotline recently released the results of their national survey. The PAL survey, part of the URI's People and Animals Living Safely program, clearly showed the fear for safety of pets is a critical component in a person's decision in leaving abusive situations. The findings are staggering, with 97% of respondents saying that keeping their pets is an important factor in deciding to seek shelter, and 50% saying they would not consider shelter for themselves if they could not take their pets with them. To discuss the important findings in this survey, I was joined by Danielle Emery, URI's Director of People and Animals Living Safely program. Before we start talking about the report that was conducted by the Urban Resource Institute and the National Domestic Violence Hotline, I want to talk about what domestic violence is, because I believe there can be some misunderstandings. And I think when you hear the phrase domestic violence, some folks, myself included, when I first started learning about this stuff, you get a very specific picture in your mind of what that is. So before we delve into the subject matter at hand, could you tell us a little bit about what domestic violence entails and all the different ways it can appear?
Yeah, I think that common image, that it's a really common experience for people to have that image in their head. And what we and research has found over the past few decades is that domestic violence goes across socioeconomic lines, race lines, gender lines. It's really, it's an issue that impacts everyone. And you tend to, anyone you meet, if they don't have their own personal experience, they have family connections, they have someone who they're close to who is a survivor of domestic violence, it permeates society, all parts of society. In the United States, nearly 20 people per minute are physically assaulted by an intimate partner. So that's more than 10 million individuals each year. And that's only physical assault. And then you can also factor in psychological abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse. And you think about, how the animal welfare fits into that, and how, animals can be used as part of that manipulation or to intimidate or coerce survivors into certain behaviors because of that emotional and psychological connection.
Yeah, it is a wide-ranging problem, and as you mentioned, that's an awful lot of people being impacted by this on a very, very regular basis. And I have heard, I do not know if there are any confirmed reports of this, that as the pandemic unfolded and as stay-at-home orders, for example, here in Ontario, where I am, we have been under what I have been told is the longest series of lockdowns in the world as a result of the pandemic. And mental health has declined, and the potential rate of abuse has likely gone up a great bit. I think it was even in this report I read that, and it could have been another one, that with children not in school, that's often how some of this abuse is first identified, is
Absolutely.
because they're out of the home.
Yes, with teachers as mandated reporters. And I think how it, for domestic violence, a lot of how people get services, access help through hotlines or resource centers is, other opportunities that they get to get out of the house, to go to their jobs, to go grocery shopping, to go socialize, to see friends and family who may notice, you're behaving differently, or notice that there's something, just that seems different about you, or they may notice an injury. And when people's, when those social networks aren't as active, there's definitely less opportunity for people to notice and to be able to seek help, outside help. So we found in New York City that it's interesting, the number of telephone hotline calls actually was not higher at the start of COVID, but things like text and chat became much more common because people were isolated at home with their abusers. And so they were not able to safely make a phone call. And so COVID actually, I think, was a igniter of a lot of domestic violence providers realizing that they needed to develop their chat and text services for folks.
Yeah, and in your field, managing these situations, there has always been sort of a need to be ahead of the curve in terms of what is publicly known and what can be done. I recall, again, in my time as a journalist, trying to reach out to a social service that dealt with folks trying to escape domestic violence. And just agreeing on a location for the interview required me to sign an NDA ahead of time and have a very serious conversation with them about, like, we need to be able to be sure that you are not going to provide information that may get out. On the URI website, there is a great feature, and I've seen this elsewhere, and it's an escape button in the corner of the web browser. Yep. So if you're on the web and someone comes up, you click that, it wipes that website and opens up a new tab. Right. And it's, it's the stuff you don't want to acknowledge necessarily is necessary, but very much is. And that also is one of the reasons it can be so hard for folks to get away from these situations.
Correct. And safety planning is a huge part of what we and what all hotline or DV service providers do with survivors. So it's recognizing, that survivors are, they know their situation the best and they know how to keep themselves safe. And so we really follow their lead about when they're comfortable making phone calls or not making phone calls, if they want to be chatting, if they are comfortable coming in person or not coming in person. So really following their lead on what works for them and how they know to keep themselves saved. They're the experts in their own life and their own situation. And so following that lead. And I think pets also are a part of that too, of following that lead. If someone is telling you that pets are an important part of their safety planning, for advocates and hotline workers to hear that survivors are saying that, and the importance of programs that can assist those people.
Absolutely. And working our way over to the survey, which is kind of the basis for this conversation, that was done, as we said, in partnership with the Domestic Violence Hotline, which is referred to as the Hotline. And I guess one of the things I find interesting in reading both the executive summary and the full report is you weren't necessarily looking for new information. It was trying to maybe get more current information, I guess. Is that what the foundation of doing the survey was?
I think more current information and then also a broader picture. So a lot of the research and stats that have existed to date have been on a much smaller scale, and usually are asking survivors who've already entered domestic violence shelter about their pets. And so we were looking to hear from people who were contacting the hotline, while they were in that moment of crisis, while they were in maybe still in that abusive situation and looking for services, to hear from them in that moment, to get a sense of, of that population, which is much larger than the size of the population that ultimately would enter shelter. What are their needs? What are they saying about their pets and the importance of the pets in their healing and their staying ability to stay safe? And how can we, increase the number of resources and the access to information and, safe places for people to go with their pets.
And I'll ask, I'll just sort of turn it over to you. I've got the key findings up, and they are heartbreaking to me to look at, and really speak to need. What were the results what you expected, or was it information that maybe was surprising? What was the the key takeaways, I guess?
Yeah, yeah. I don't think that the results were surprising. Working with survivors on a daily basis, we have more than 50 families in our program currently. We've had over 300 families and more than 400 pets in our shelters. And what we know is that accessing safety is very important. But what is also important is that emotional connection and being able to stay with their pets as they are recovering from this traumatic situation. And so for me, hearing that 97% of respondents said that keeping their pets with them is an important factor in deciding whether or not to seek shelter, it's not surprising necessarily, but I think to, hear it from more than, close to 2,500 people, that is an important factor is very powerful. And then this other high percentage, 91% indicating that pets' emotional support and physical protection were significant in their ability to survive and heal. So that's something that we think about as someone is moving out of an abusive situation and moving into their healing. What are these supports? What are the resources that are going to enable children to be able to go through that healing process? And how important are the pets in that process? And if we can keep people together with their pets, how much, faster or deeper or more meaningful will that healing be for them?
I think the other element of this that needs to really be highlighted is the reasoning behind this. And again, I think it's easy from a position of privilege to sit and say, particularly as a man sitting from a position of privilege, to be able to say, well, why don't they just leave and figure out the pets later? Mm-hmm. And that is also, again, this is something I've read before, but is indicated in the key findings. And this just made my heart sink into my stomach when I read these three numbers about the situation involving the abuser and the pets.
Yeah. So the link between violence against animals and violence against people is very well established. Yeah. So when there's violence against an animal or a person in a home, everyone in that home is at risk. And we absolutely see that in domestic violence as well. So from our survey, 48% of the respondents said that they were worried that their abusive partner would harm or kill their pets. 37% reported that an abusive partner had already threatened to harm or kill pets. And 29% said that their pets had already been harmed or killed. So those are high percentages of the people who are calling in. And the way it's sometimes described as pets may be quote unquote soft targets, or ways that in the same way that unfortunately like children may be seen as soft targets as well, if they can't defend themselves in the same way that someone who is a full-size adult may be able to. And then of course it's exploiting that emotional connection. So pets are used as targets because abusers know how important they are to the survivors. And they know that it's, why don't they leave and figure it out later? They know that it's that coercive tool to say, if you do leave, I'll kill the pet. And so knowing that, leaving without the pet isn't an option for everyone to be able to stay safe.
And as part of that too, it is identified that knowledge that there are options in terms of getting out with pets, while it is very limited still. And that certainly has been my experience in Canada when I've looked into this. It is still very limited, but there are options now. But the stats suggest that most folks don't know that that's a thing.
Yeah, so our survey showed that about 72% of respondents were not aware that some domestic violence shelters accept pets. So while it is a limited number, there has been quite a lot of awareness raising or, attention as someone who's like inside the field, you think like this issue is getting so much more attention and people must know. But there's really a lot more work that needs to be done to make sure that this information is getting to those who are experiencing violence, who are seeking shelter. And really the domestic violence field for so long, the answer was just no, pets are not included in what we do. We don't have the capacity for that. And so I think people, even when they're asked if they have pets, I think a lot of times someone may think that the correct answer to that question, the answer that will help them access shelter, access services, is to say no and to figure out the pets separately from the safety planning that they're doing with, for the humans in the situation. And so a lot of the work that we do is really trying to spread awareness and knowledge amongst DV service advocates and providers for how they're asking questions about pets. And even if there isn't co-sheltering or co-living available in their community, are there organizations that can provide things like food that would be able to help with transportation to get an animal to a family member's house, that may be able to do very short boarding or foster care? How, even if it's not co-living and pets are coming into shelter like we offer with PALS, how can you get services for people and their pets in this moment of crisis?
And the respondents have indicated, and again, this is, I think, well documented through other work too, 50% of respondents would not consider shelter for themselves if they could not take their pets with them. So that is half of the people in this situation, half.
Yeah, and I think, for a lot of people who love animals and have pets and love their pets, that also seems like an obvious kind of statistic. But I think for, it's in that same way that it's following the survivor's lead. And in that moment, what are they telling us is important? We also have some people who may make that, 50% of those said they would leave their pets behind. And so those people are also making the decision that, their personal safety, or they're not going to be able to help their pets or their children if they're not out of that situation. And so really centering the survivor's needs and honoring the decisions that people make, either way.
Yeah, I think that must be a difficult thing to communicate publicly, is the not judging folks in that situation. And that's something that comes up sometimes in animal welfare circles. And we have to have that conversation about, look, we don't know the situation and you have to do the best you can in the moment, and not judge folks who have to make that choice. It is a god-awful choice that anyone would ever have to make at all. And we should not judge them. And I love the fact that this entire thing is based on what the individuals are saying they need, as opposed to what we think they should need.
So, obviously the statistics around animals being at risk and wanting to help animals and also help people, like they're powerful, and they, speak to a need for services for animals, but also, we're really trying to center the human experience. And so saying like, this is an animal welfare issue, but it's also, it's about the human survivors, and recognizing them as full humans that have a variety of needs. And for those who have pets, one of their needs is they need help with their pets. And so how can we just raise an awareness, raise the availability of services, and get resources out into communities for them to be able to better respond to survivors?
Absolutely. And there's a couple of elements in the full report I wanted to go over briefly, because I think they're of note and interest. One of them was integrating pets into shelter environment by including services for animals at all shelter locations. This sounds, again, it's one of those situations where I can very easily sit in my chair from very far away and say, well, shelters aren't equipped to do that. Or on the flip side, why aren't shelters doing that? What are the challenges on the shelter side to accommodating or finding solutions? Because I imagine there are also people who are going to be afraid of dogs,
absolutely,
or allergic to cats or whatever. And space issues, landlord issues, all of that.
Yeah, so domestic violence shelter, as you may imagine, is a complex and challenging environment. You have people who are leaving very difficult situations, recovering from trauma, lots of children in the space. So yeah, our shelter is actually 80% children. So it's a dynamic environment. And I think for a lot of shelter providers, they would say it's a very under-resourced environment also, and from a staffing and finances perspective. And so I think a challenge for a lot of DV service providers has been just this fear of taking on a whole other element of a person's needs, and not feeling like they are equipped to do so, or they have the capacity to do so. And then just like that additional adding that additional complexity to the space. So, it's already a pretty complex environment to navigate. And so that's why, we're really trying, like our program, we have co-living. So we're in New York City. We provide services to over 1,200 survivors every day. So we have very large apartment building style shelters. And so that means that most of our families are in their own individual apartments. And so them being able to bring their pets in is pretty straightforward because the animal is living with them in the apartment. And so not every shelter in cities, in smaller cities, in more suburban or rural areas, shelters look very different. So I said we have over 1,200 beds. There are a lot of shelters across Canada, across the US that have 6 beds. So these are like very, very different in size and scope of work and scope of number of people served. And so I think just acknowledging that it doesn't have to look the same for every DV provider. It doesn't have to be animals have come into the shelter environment and they live together. There could be on-site kenneling. There could be partnerships with animal welfare organizations that provide short-term boarding or short-term foster care. There are a lot of different ways that this can look, and that community assessment and community partnership is such an important part of figuring out what works for our community. So for New York, where the scope is just so large and the number of clients being served every night is, the supply still does not match the demand of the number of people who need shelter with their pets. But for us, it would be impossible for us to do a foster care program.
Yeah, it's too many animals, just the sheer number.
Too many animals, yes. And then depending on like what the kind of, I don't know, like status of the animal shelter is in your community, are they still really focused on like reducing population and, reducing euthanasia and really getting animals adopted? Or, are they doing a little more creative stuff? Are they doing more community programs? Yeah. Do they have an active foster program? Do they have a lot of foster providers? Is this something that they could incorporate into their services? And so it's really just making the connections between animal welfare and domestic violence, especially, and then, having honest conversations about what feels possible and how, and just start somewhere. So like we also started only in one of our shelter buildings, only taking cats, because we were like, this is where we can start. And now we're at 7 different buildings and we take cats, dogs, all small animals of all types. People can have multiple pets, and we have dedicated staff. So as we've grown, we've been able to say we can do a lot more, but we recognize that when we started, we couldn't. And that's probably where a lot of providers are. And so even just being able to ask the question about people's pets and knowing about the resources that are available to them, beyond domestic violence in the community is a beneficial place to start.
And for folks who are curious about the scope of those animals, the report has a fun infographic. It's a weird Christmas song too. 3 bearded dragons, 168 cats, 11 fish, 4 hamsters, 26 turtles, 5 birds, 174 dogs, 6 guinea pigs, and 3 rabbits. Which is an impressive menagerie of domestic animals.
I know the turtles were surprising to me at first, but yeah, there's a surprising number of turtles in New York City. But yeah, mostly cats and dogs, but we do accept any pet that people are looking to bring. We accept 3 pets at the moment, but we really like make the decision based on the size of the unit and the number of individuals in it, and just to make sure that everyone can be safe and happy.
One of the elements in this as well is you look at support to help people and animals heal, especially those impacted by violence, by providing education and resources. And there's a community element of this I'd like to get to next. In this regard, though, you had mentioned that you're in the fortunate situation to be able to bring in some animal helpers, so to speak, in various capacities. What does this support look like? What is it that you or I can do that other organizations could also learn from in terms of helping people and animals heal and potentially healing together?
Yeah, I think, we're lucky we're in New York City, so there's a lot of organizations here and resources available. But, when we started, we found an animal welfare partner because we were human services providers. We were not experts in animals in any way. And so really recognizing that we needed someone to help us think through the policies, think through what the program is going to look like in our spaces, think through what the physical spaces would look like, what supplies would we need to provide, what assessments would we need to potentially do with animals, and really, I think, like help us form, just the basic structure of what a pet program could look like. And so I think that's an important initial relationship to start, is for domestic violence providers to even just introduce themselves to the animal welfare community. So we have on our team, we have staff who who work at the intersection of DV and animal welfare, so have experience in both environments. But most people who work in DV don't have a lot of experience with animals. And so even just basic, education about basic dog behavior, or visiting an animal shelter and like seeing how, yes, you have a lot of animals in this space, but they're being cared for safely and well, and seeing how people are interacting with animals. Because if you don't have that experience, you may come more from a place of fear, or, thinking that it's going to disrupt the environment or bring negative things into the environment. So that just building that relationship and learning from animal welfare, I think, is a really interesting place to start. We also, as people who love animals, like on our team, I think we take the human animal bond and understanding of the human animal bond for granted. And so, working with humane education groups, bringing them in to like talk with children, but also then the adults are there and like learning from that humane education. When we do internal training, we have staff members who say, well, I never realized that animals and human, like that they mean that much to people. Just like I've never had pets. This wasn't a thing in my family. This wasn't an experience that I had. Yep. And I didn't know that. And so I think, if there are people within an organization, if that, may not be a decision maker, but you're a person who loves animals, or if you are a decision maker, just like bringing it to your leadership, bringing it to people to say, like, it doesn't necessarily mean to be, I want to do co-sheltering, but it could be, I want to try to bring therapy animal teams in. I'd like to have a humane education, could we have humane education? And there's tons of research out there that shows the benefit that these programs have for both adults and children, to really just start teaching and learning about the impact that animals have on our lives, especially for people who've experienced trauma, and the importance of, being able to have those connections and maintain those connections.
Yeah, it's one of those things, you can armchair psychiatrist or psychologist that one, and just healing from any kind of trauma with the support of a beloved domestic animal. I've got you would have heard her chewing on her bone earlier when we were talking, and that's going to make it into the podcast. Don't worry. My JJ, like having her around in my life, it makes such a difference. And growing up without pets, other than, the very quickly disappearing ones, it is something certainly that I can imagine all of the benefits of having that experience, and particularly when it's someone's, it's the family member, and that safety. We see the benefits of that. Dog guides up here, they've done some studies on autism support dogs, and the range of benefits that comes between mental health and animal welfare and having connection with animals. So it certainly makes sense to be exploring that within this. And that builds into this community response model. Building a Movement is the name of the chapter in the reports. By the way, if you are interested in the subject matter, the report is linked in the show notes, folks, and I recommend checking it out. It's very well put together. As I said, it is heartbreaking, but it is stuff that we all need to know, and we all need to be part of the solution. So I do recommend checking that out. And the community response model, I thought that's an interesting idea in that you're no longer just also looking at your shelter. You're no longer looking at this is what we're doing, but it's starting to look at how you connect, as you said, with the animal welfare community, but then also educating everybody about everything, it almost feels like. So the animal welfare folks can learn a bit about domestic violence work, and on your side, you learn a bit more about the animal welfare work. And I imagine that can then also expand out to other ancillary or adjacent social services.
Yeah, I think if people have not otherwise heard of the National Link Coalition, I believe, I don't know if they have any presence in Canada, but it is a coalition based in the U.S. that is really, acknowledging that when there's violence in the home, everyone is at risk. And this kind of idea of like building up cross-reporting, building up like, being able as a domestic violence provider, or advocate, if you hear about pets or feel like animals are at risk, like being able to connect with animal welfare. And so what we're really trying to do as a DV service provider is to speak to other DV service providers and say that complicated environment, this complex endeavor of helping survivors, of sheltering survivors and families, we know it. We speak that language. We've been doing it. We know how hard it is. We've had this program for 8 years. Let us teach you from our experience, not say, you need to do exactly what we do, but, have you asked all the questions, all the concerns, the fears, the worries that you and your staff had? All of our staff has had those as well. We've heard every question. So everything that you're worried about, we can, help you figure out how to respond to those worries on an individual basis. And, having both the animal welfare and domestic violence background, I think we speak both languages well. That's kind of how I describe it. And so I think it really is important in recognizing that, because DV is such a widespread issue, people who are experiencing domestic violence or abuse victims, they may not be they may be at an animal shelter looking to relinquish their pets. And they're saying that the reason they're there is housing, is because because they have to leave their housing because they're going into shelter. And so how do we make that the animal welfare environment more, not make people who work in animal welfare also domestic violence advocates, but make that a safe environment where people know or are aware that if they are safe to disclose that information, that they will then have access to domestic violence resources, that the animal welfare organization can make those referrals, and that there may be different policies or programs in place to assist them with their animals. And so really, wanting to share this really robust, long experience that we've had in doing this, and realizing that, even if we expanded and we're able to serve every person in New York City, like there's still a whole country, a whole world out there of survivors who need help. And so how can we, share our experience as DV service providers to help, other DV service providers, feel like they can tackle this in their own communities and make it as possible for them as we can.
It's finding all of these connections is so important. And I just looked it up while we were chatting. NationalLinkCoalition.org is the American one. And interestingly, it has a link down the left side to every one of the states on how do I report suspected abuse, and a lot of other great resources. Canada does have one, a Canadian Violence Links coalition, which appears to be organized by Humane Canada, which is a national a national animal organization that specifically focuses on shelters, animal shelters. So there are some workshops, conferences, and links at Humane Canada for folks up here. who wanted to take a look. Again, I'm just going to go back to this report because it's so well done. It asks all of the questions I have next. So what's needed next? I think that's the ultimate question of it. You now have this broad data set that really, in addition to what we already had on the books about this, it really gives more depth to the situation and the complexities of it. You've got some resources in place that are outstanding. You are all extraordinarily dedicated individuals. So how do you go forward from here, and what is necessary either from the public, the government, or community partners to make this more successful and more available in a widespread manner?
So I think we've touched on a lot of these things, but I also appreciate that you said the public, government, private, because I do think that this is an issue that needs a response from all of those entities. And really, because we need people to have an awareness and knowledge of the issue. So this need for shelter, that's a huge one, is continuing to, put these statistics out of people are not going to leave an abusive situation if they're not able to bring their pets, and that importance of having their pets with them. And so, but then we need funders, we need government, we need private public partnerships, we need more resources for the service providers who are trying to work for survivors, that are trying to provide that access to safety, are able to do so in a way that is fiscally possible. I think we need to recognize that there's more training needed for people who are at the crisis point. So people who are working as hotline advocates. This also reflects on people who may be working in animal welfare admissions, or people who are working at DV resource centers. Just knowledge about the intersection of domestic violence and pet ownership. Not only the risk of violence towards pets, but also the importance of pets in people's lives, and what a difference like having programs that factor in both the humans and the animals involved can make in people's lives.
Absolutely. And I think one of the greatest flaws in our thinking as a society right now is that help is available and people just need to ask, but we need to do a hell of a job letting them know that help is available still.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, and especially with domestic violence, like you acknowledged at points in this conversation, is, most people have some version of personal experience, but if you don't, or even if you do, it's a very sensitive topic. And people are not, disclosure is hard. It's really hard for people to disclose, especially, depending on what point in their healing process they are in. And so there's a lot of sensitivity, a lot of, not directly asking, but sort of making yourself known as a safe space for people, and as a space where people can get help, and where they won't be judged for making a decision to not leave, or to, whatever decision they may make, but really creating that safety. So it's not only, letting people know that there's a hotline to call, but letting them know that there's a hotline where they're going to get compassionate, trauma-informed care that feels responsive to their needs and to them as individuals.
Absolutely. And there's one of the other little things in here I wanted to call out, because I think it's important. And this actually came up in a couple of reports I've read of surveys of. One of them was regarding animal advocates, and one of them was, I don't remember what the basis of it was. But in the survey, I'll see if I can find the actual statement in here somewhere. As a sidebar, I believe. It was speaking, though, to the need to have a better understanding of how this all impacts vulnerable populations, inclusive of LGBTQ plus communities and people who identify in one of those. And it's even though we've got all of this knowledge, there's still more we have to learn. Yeah. There's still more we have to do to try and solve this and help and mitigate and all of that.
I think that, that's the domestic violence movement, in the 60s and 70s, domestic violence didn't exist, or, we thought it wasn't a thing that existed. And so, it really started as the battered women's movement as to help women, and then women and their children who are at risk. And then, as our understanding of the issue and as we've evolved as a society, and also and realized that, this isn't only impacting women, this isn't only impacting children. Everyone is welcome in our shelters. So they're, men, women, trans, we accept everyone. We accept people who don't have children. That's another part of this is, historically, a lot of shelter has been for families or for people with children. And so really trying to expand the population of people that we're serving. And then, recognizing the intersections between, poverty, homelessness, and seeing how that plays into people's needs, and trying to do the best we can to address those needs at the same time that we're also working to address the domestic violence and caring for the pets. So it is a large issue that our understanding of continues to evolve. And I think that, it's important to us as an agency to be inclusive and welcoming, and to recognize that, there are certain populations that are more impacted by domestic violence, Black communities and communities of color, Black women in particular. I don't have the statistics right in front of me, but the numbers are pretty astounding. And also the number of people in LGBTQ relationships who've experienced abuse, sexual assault is very high. And so what additional resources do we have for those communities beyond shelter, and including their animals, and how do we really try to be inclusive and make a difference in everybody's lives?
To read the full URI PALS report, visit urinyc.org or visit the links in this week's show notes. I want to extend my thanks to Danielle for joining the show for this interview, and everyone at Urban Resource Institute for their ongoing work. This episode was difficult to research, record, and present. I hope I have done it justice. If there are ways the introductions or links can be improved to best serve the audience, please reach out directly to me at Michael, Michael, at thefurbearers.com, or by visiting defenderradio.com, and I will do my best to update it. I also want to thank all of you for listening and for your ongoing empathy and compassion. We can make this world a safer, kinder place, and it starts with understanding. Until next time, I'm Michael Howie for Defender Radio.